Hello, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Future of Work webinar. We will wait another moment for more attendees to join us, and we'll begin shortly. Good morning, everyone. It's about a couple minutes past 11, and we do want to get this started so that we can make sure that everyone gets all of the wonderful information that we are presenting today. So welcome to the Future of Work webinar series. Today's topic is self-compassion for returning back to on-site. I'm Michelle Quint, and I'm the Executive Director of Health Human Resources, and I will serve as your MC for this session. This session is one of 6 topics that we are offering as we begin the transition to on-site work and a hybrid work environment. All sessions are being recorded, so if you have colleagues who missed today's live session or other sessions, they will be available on the Future of Work website. This is a webinar format, so while you can see our co-hosts and our speaker, we cannot see you. You'll notice a Q&A box versus a chat box, so feel free to submit your questions during the session, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible, given our time constraints. So now on to our main event. I'd first like to introduce you to our host for today's session, Brian O'Day. Brian is our Executive Director for Marketing and Communications for UCI Health. So Brian, why don't you tell us a little bit about your UCI experience and why this particular session is of importance to you or interest to you?
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, my UCI experience, I've been here now about 2.5 years, and the last year and a half, like everyone's, has been very interesting. A bit of a roller coaster, ups and downs. Stressful but also rewarding. And my interest in this particular seminar and the whole webinar series, I think, they've been really excellent. This one in particular, though, I've been coming in pretty regularly the last year and a half, but a lot of my staff is working remotely, and they have concerns about coming back, on any kind of whether it's full-time in the office or even part-time. Some of them have kids at home, and just have concerns about the state of the pandemic in general. So I want to have some tools ready to be able to help them if and when they need it. So I thought this would be a very good one for me to participate in. I'd like to now introduce our speaker for the series, Deidre Hughes. Deidre joins us from UCI's Susan Samueli Integrative Health Institute, where she specializes in leading adults, young adults, and adolescents to integrate mindfulness and self-compassion practices into their daily lives. Deidre is a trained teacher for mindful self-compassion, as well as mindful self-compassion for teens and young adults. She's also a trained teacher of Project Wayfinder, which is a program launched at Stanford University to help guide participants through contemplative practices that foster a mindset founded upon meaning and purpose. Deidre has certifications from the International Mindfulness Teachers Association and Mindful Schools. She holds a tenured position at Fulton College, where she coordinates the college's mindfulness program and teaches mindfulness courses. Please welcome Deidre. Welcome, Deidre.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that introduction. And let me go ahead and share my slides and begin. Just to to begin. Thank you. Okay, so thank you for that great introduction, and much gratitude for inviting me here to talk about self-compassion and compassion for others, and how we might be able to integrate these concepts as we begin to return back to work on site. My hope is that this information will be really easily digestible and that you can use it even starting today and as you move into transitioning back to the on-site environment. Hopefully that these practices can help you to ease some of the stress and anxiety associated with making changes. Any change inevitably carries with it a bit of stress and sometimes even anxiety. So I'd like to just give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. So initially, I would like to introduce some key concepts from UC researchers about our mental well-being as we consider returning to on-site work. These were recently published in a University of California news, in case you're interested in checking it out. And then I'd like to talk to you about what mindful self-compassion is. This is a conceptual framework that was created by Kristen Neff, a researcher at UT Austin, and Chris Germer, a Harvard psychologist. And after I've given you a bit of information, background information about mindful self-compassion, I'd like to guide you through some informal practices that you can use to bolster and to grow your own self-compassion routine and practices as you transition back to on-site work. And then finally, a colleague of mine is going to present the different offerings from UCI, Susan Samueli, Integrative Health Institute, these resources that you can use to learn more about self-compassion and compassion for others. So I would like to begin with a quote from a researcher, a UC Riverside psychologist, about change and our neurobiology. So the quote is, "Humans are inherently a social species, and changes in people's interactions with those around them influence their neurobiology." So we know that greater interaction with others actually leads to positive outcomes, and that we're hardwired to connect and interact with others and to be social. Likewise, an absence of social interaction can lead to depressive states, anxious states, and negative psychological states. So when we think about this for returning to work, to on-site work, we can, Dr. Michalska talks about how, the fact that we have become more used to interacting with fewer people in the last year and a half has actually influenced our neurobiology, so that we are more used to not being around as many people. And then as a result, the thought of returning to meetings, teaching classes, in-person social events associated with work can actually be pretty overwhelming initially and can lead to greater anxiety, particularly as we've not been exercising these social skills in the last year and a half. So what I want to kind of begin with is just to mention and to really affirm that if you're feeling anxious or stressed right now, that is completely normal, given what we have all collectively gone through in the last year and a half. Dr. Michalska kind of concludes with a comment that I found to be really meaningful. And she talks about, as we consider moving back to on-site work, that it's really important to be kind to ourselves and to remember that others are also facing similar challenges with stress, anxiety, and even feeling kind of depressed as we consider moving back to the on-site environment. And we should view this actually as an opportunity to become more empathic and more compassionate as we collectively all together are negotiating this change to re-entering the physical space at work. We're going to return to that. But before we do, I want to move on to another quote by another UC Riverside faculty member, Jan Stetz. She's a sociologist. And she does a beautiful job, I think, of defining and describing anxiety. So as I read this, I'd like you to think about COVID and the pandemic and our experience of that. And just keep that in mind. Anxiety is an emotion about a distant, potentially negative outcome that is uncertain and unpredictable. It is longer lasting than fear, more future oriented than present fear, and is less likely to have a specific elicitor or terminator. As we read this definition and description about anxiety, we see how the past year and a half and the current COVID circumstances would naturally elicit an anxious response. We're coming out of a pandemic where many people have been sick, many people have died. We still have unknowns around the variants and other elements of COVID. So our own sense of safety for ourselves and our loved ones is still tenuous in a sense, and we're all aware of that. Also, other aspects of anxiety are layered on top of this. When we think about going back to on-site, it's very natural to wonder about what will my job look like? How will I negotiate a hybrid dynamic? Which meetings might be on Zoom and which ones won't be? Do I have the skills to negotiate all of this? And then we also might have some anxiety about what we've become accustomed to in terms of our own family life and negotiating family and work and that dynamic. Can my family members who remain at home take care of themselves, or will they need help in some way? And then even beyond that, there could potentially be personal issues. We've had time for reflection. As we return to on-site work, we may be thinking about our own career trajectory. Do we want to make shifts and changes? How is that influenced by moving back to the on-site environment? So all of these things are layered one on top of the next, and it is very natural and normal for that to generate anxiety because the uncertainty is very is heightened, and and things still remain quite unpredictable in certain ways. So now I want to circle back around to Dr. Michalska's comment I mentioned initially on the slide, the prior slide, which is that given all this, right, the fact that if you're feeling anxious or stressed, that it's normal, probably the people around you are feeling the same way, that as a next step, it's really important to be kind to yourself and to remember that others are experiencing many of these same emotions, and that this is actually an opportunity to develop a greater capacity for empathy and for compassion for self and other, because we're, as a group, collectively experiencing something together. And then finally, I wanted to talk about, to mention Carrie Cooper, who's a professor of organizational psychology and health at the University of Manchester. It's a very simple, straightforward quote. Uncertainty and lack of control upon return can lead to heightened stress, anxiety, and depression. So if you haven't heard it already from me, I really just want to emphasize that it's affirm that it's natural and normal to feel heightened stress and anxiety right now. Barnard College president and cognitive psychologist Sean Balick states that the height of anxiety usually comes right before the event, with all the considerations and all the what if scenarios that go through our minds. So if you are experiencing anxiety and stress right now, I would just mention that maybe it can help you to feel a little bit better to know that this is most likely the worst of it, that even when you enter into the environment, that some of the uncertainty will start to decrease. And some of the lack of control that you may feel that's heightening the anxiety will start to lessen. And so that we're really moving into this place and time where it will improve. And then again, reminding yourself that this is an opportunity to develop both empathy and compassion for self and other. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about self-compassion, define the concept, the framework, as it's been developed by Kristen Neff and Chris Germer. So self-compassion is extending compassion to one's self in instances of perceived inadequacy, failure, or general suffering. I think we would all agree that the last year and a half has certainly been a period of general suffering as a collective and as individuals. So it's an ideal time to actually pick up a self-compassion practice. Neff defines 3 elements of self-compassion that I want to introduce to you today: self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. So self-kindness. With self-compassion, we try to treat ourselves with kindness, with care, with love, with understanding, with support, acceptance. Just exactly the way we would treat a friend who is struggling. Research shows that most people treat themselves, more than 77%, I believe it's over 70% of people, treat themselves more harshly than they would ever treat their friends. Research shows that most of us say things that are mean, critical, even cruel to ourselves when we perceive our own inadequacies, when we meet failure, when we suffer. Things that we would never ever say to a loved one. So with self-compassion, we're working to alleviate the suffering through taking an action of kindness, actively soothing and comforting ourselves when we're in pain or when we're struggling. So it's involving this support for ourselves, protecting ourselves from harm. The second component, common humanity, is recognizing that our own experience of things not going right, or our own imperfection or challenge, is actually part of the larger human experience. That recognizing that everyone struggles and that this is normal and common to the human experience, and that in a way it is what bonds us to one another. In this way, we're developing a sense of we-ness, that we're in it together, that we are not alone. Often when we struggle, or fail, we feel something's gone wrong and that this shouldn't be happening. And it's like a slippery slope that moves very quickly from that feeling of abnormality to then feeling like there's something wrong with me or wrong, and then feeling very alone. Of course, this is kind of predicated on the idea that everyone else is leading these perfectly normal, happy lives, which is untrue. So common humanity is this element of really reminding ourselves and internalizing that it's actually what's bonding us to other humans is suffering, and that this is part of the human experience. And then the final element is mindfulness. In order to respond with self-compassion and to be kind and caring to ourselves when we're struggling, we have to recognize and know we're struggling. And we have to be able to turn toward the pain of that moment, the stress and anxiety, perhaps of returning back to on-site work, and to be able to be with those feelings as they are. When we develop a mindfulness practice, we're working to develop more balanced awareness so that we're not suppressing what's happening, we're not avoiding what we're feeling, we're not getting carried away in the drama of what's happening, and we're not over-identifying with what's happening, the emotions that are arising. So mindfulness is a really, really important element of self-compassion. In other words, if we could sum up this whole framework of self-compassion, it's about developing the ability to be an inner ally, to be a friend to ourselves. We can really work on this in a very simple way by just, when something challenging happens, asking ourselves how we might respond to a friend in a similar situation. What might we say? How might we approach? What would be our affect, our tone, our way of interacting? What actions might we take? And then offering that to ourselves. In order to begin to really work with self-compassion, we need to really understand mindfulness because it's the foundation of self-compassion. John Kabat-Zinn developed the mindfulness-based stress reduction program, MBSR. He's very, very well known for bringing mindfulness into the secular realm. His definition of mindfulness is the awareness that arises through paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. This is important because in order to be self-compassionate, we need to be able to notice and turn toward our difficulties before we can respond with kindness. So we have to be able to accept that it's happening, not blow it out of proportion, not ignore it, so that then we can take some sort of skillful action to support ourselves. Often when we don't like what's happening, we avoid or we shut down. You might even consider which of these things are your tendencies. We all have our tendencies. We repress, maybe we self-medicate in unhealthy ways. We become reactive, fly off the handle, make unskillful choices. When we work on developing a mindfulness practice as an emotional resource, we learn to turn toward what's happening with a calm, balanced mind, providing a bit more spaciousness to respond rather than react so that we can be more skillful in the moment. So I'm going to shift now to some things that you might be able to do, real practical practices that you can do to integrate self-compassion and compassion for others into your daily life starting today and moving toward transitioning into on-site work when the moments of stress arise, which they will inevitably, no matter what, happen as you make a change. So the first strategy is to acknowledge the stress, the weariness, the frustration, the anxiety, the pain, whatever is showing up for you. I have in parentheses just quick little phrases that you can use to remember these things. So name it to tame it. Label the emotion. If you simply label or name the emotion, it can help to disentangle the emotion from your experience of it. In essence, to kind of take away the stickiness of the emotion. And usually then we can feel a bit of spaciousness around the emotion. David Cresswell did really important work in this field. He's a psychologist at Carnegie Mellon. And he actually discovered that when we label the difficult emotion, the activity in our amygdala, which is our fear response, in our brain, right? It registers the fight or flight response or freeze response, becomes less active and is less likely to trigger a stress reaction in the body. So how we label is important as well. Notice the tone, how you're kind of naming the emotion, and try to use a gentle, kind of accepting tone. This is stress. I'm feeling pain. I'm so exhausted. This is hard. This is fatigue. The second strategy I'd like you to think about working with is becoming curious and open to the impact on your body of whatever is difficult, of the emotion. You could remember this as feel it to heal it. Trauma researchers in the last 10 years have done phenomenal work showing again and again that somatic awareness, noticing the impact of emotion on our body, is a very effective way to move through the emotion so it doesn't become stuck and we don't become impacted over time again and again by the emotion. Emotions have a physical component. So if you're feeling apprehensive about moving back or going back to on-site work, you might ask yourself, where am I feeling this? Am I feeling stress and tension in my shoulders, my neck? Is my stomach upset? As your body's preparing to meet the challenge, your body is reacting. It's not just in your mind. Your body is involved as well. And being able to notice what's happening in your body can create shifts in your experience. You're in essence learning to explore with curiosity, right? With non-judgment. We go back to the mindfulness piece, the felt sense of the emotion. So we can ask ourselves, where am I feeling this emotion in my body? Or what I like to say honestly is, where does this emotion live in me? Where is it living in me right now? When we locate the emotion and anchor the emotion in our body, the difficult emotion starts to transform and change. We develop a different relationship to the emotion. Oftentimes when we feel a strong emotion, really stressed, like we become very quickly over-identified with it. It's almost like we are the stress. When we ask ourselves where it's living in us, we develop a little bit of spaciousness that allows us to be separate and can loosen the contraction associated with our experience of that emotion. And then, of course, we bring compassion and understanding to our experience of that emotion, care. We kind of establish this loving and accepting relationship with the emotion. And then we have more strength and capacity to see and feel what's happening. So the third strategy I'd like you to think about is using a comforting gesture. Typically what happens is when we meet challenge and difficulty, especially even failure, something that we didn't do as well, or an inadequacy maybe, it's a better way to say it, then we treat ourselves harshly with this critical inner voice. And then what happens is we are tapping into our threat defense system. This is like connected to our reptilian brain, the very, very oldest part of our brain. The threat response becomes, activated. We're enacting it upon ourselves, and it causes stress and is related to other negative psychological states. So we're actually triggering our own amygdala, our own fight or flight response, which releases stress hormones and causes the states to intensify. This is the work of Paul Gilbert, who's a really well-known compassion researcher and psychologist. So to counteract this, we can tap into our mammalian caregiving system. And there are different ways to do this, but one way to do this effectively is through comforting touch or gestures. This is the work of Steller and Keltner. Keltner's at UC Berkeley at the Greater Good Science Center. And when we do this, this releases oxytocin and other feel-good hormones. And then we're generating a sense of safety for ourselves. And this counteracts the stress generated by the threat defense system. So I want to encourage you to give this a shot right now. So at home or wherever you may be, I'd like you to just to practice and become curious about just trying some of these. And as you do this, just notice how it feels in your body. How is it feeling? Are you feeling a bit more relaxed or at ease? And different ones are going to resonate with different people. So placing one hand inside the other, right? Cupping your hands, noticing how it feels to hold one hand inside the other. A hand over the heart, feeling the pressure of your hand on your heart, the warmth of your hand. Perhaps both hands over your heart. Putting your face and cradling it in one hand or both. One hand on the abdomen and one hand over the heart. Or perhaps offering yourself a gentle hug or placing your hands on your thighs. In the next few days, perhaps experiment with these different comforting gestures. Try them in moments of stress, do them informally, and see which ones resonate with you. The final strategy I'd like to talk about is using compassion phrases directed towards yourself. You can actually come up with simple self-compassion phrases that can be an object of your attention during a formal meditation practice on a meditation cushion or in the on-site work environment, just like you could use your breath to focus on. Ideally, the phrases would be kind and clear, and they allow you to just sort of rest right? Allow your heart and your mind to rest for a moment. It's almost like we're hearing something we've needed to hear for a long time. And again, of course, the tone matters, offering these phrases with warmth and compassion and kindness. In this way, we're creating an inner dialogue of kindness and friendship and allyship with ourselves, rather than the critical voice I mentioned earlier that so many of us have. So I'm going to read a few of these and just notice if any of them resonate with you. You can even say them to yourself silently after I say them. Just notice how you feel. May I accept myself as I am. May I begin to accept myself as I am. May I forgive myself. May I be strong, calm. May I connect with my basic goodness. May I know my own value. May I live with ease. May I be enough just as I am. May I rest in love. In the next week or so, as you're thinking about this change to onsite work, maybe select one of these or write one for yourself, put it on a post-it note, place it on your computer screen, somewhere in your work environment. And when you come into work, just repeat it to yourself, maybe even a couple times a day. Begin to develop that inner dialogue of support and care and kindness for yourself. A couple of just comments I want to make before I close, which is as you begin to do this work, just notice any resistance that shows up. Resistance is the struggle that occurs when we believe our moment-to-moment experience should be other than it is. And in this way, resistance is the opposite of mindfulness. And just see if when you feel that resistance, you can let it go. Common ways we resist is by worry or rumination, overworking, overeating, anger, distraction, sleeping. So just notice if you are sort of resisting what's happening, if you can just allow it to be a bit more. There's a famous mindfulness teacher, Shinzen Young, who has this formula that's out there and makes a lot of sense, which is pain times resistance equals suffering. The more we accept the pain, the less we suffer. The catchy phrase is what we resist persists. So just become curious about the resistance. Resistance shows up for all of us, and see with you if you can play a bit with allowing it to be just a bit more. And then the other thing that you can do for yourself is just to be aware of the things that are not difficult in your life, including the things that do support you. Maybe make an intentional effort to notice the good in your life. Create a gratitude journal, or once a week, just write something down that you're grateful for. Notice the support that you do have, even if it's less than what you ideally desire. So my final thoughts are that just to mention that difficulties and challenge come and go and will your whole life. And with transition and change, as I said initially, it would be uncommon to not have anxiety and stress associated with that. But your positive attributes and your innate goodness as a person, those remain solid. And then I wanted to remind you that the way you feel about going back on site may be different than how other coworkers are feeling, and that's okay. To offer that non-judgmental awareness, that mindfulness piece as you communicate with others and notice how others are reacting. And to practice non-judgment and compassion with your coworkers as well. And finally, to use the resources available to you. We're going to introduce some of those to you in just a moment, and ask for support. Truthfully, no one does anything alone. And when we start to kind of realize how helpful it can be to ask for support, we can actually see shifts in the moment and how we're perceiving the moment. So the question was like, does it change the moment if we acknowledge that additional resources would support us? And then I just wanted to return one last time to Dr. Michalska's comment about as we take this next step into the on-site environment, it's important to be kind to ourselves, to remember that others may be facing similar challenges, and that this is an awesome opportunity to learn to be more empathic and more compassionate for ourselves and for others as we are moving collectively to physically re-enter a more social workspace. And a closing comment from Christopher Germer, who created the Mindful Self-Compassion Framework along with Kristen Neff. He says, a moment of self-compassion can change your entire day. A string of such moments can change the course of your life. I would just comment that that has been very true for me. And I would just encourage you to consider picking up and playing with some of the different strategies and resources that I mentioned today. That concludes my portion of the—
Allow some time for question and answers. And I know that there was a lot in the chat. Some of them do skew a little bit more towards being answered by our HR experts instead of our presenters. So to that end, I would like to introduce also Tanisha Willoughby. She is in our within HR. She is our workforce relations consultant and investigator. So welcome, Tanisha, to this panel. And then maybe you can, I think a lot of the questions in the chat are surrounding kind of the same idea, difficulty with supervisors or management about that return to work and the anxiety. And so maybe you can address them as a whole.
Yes. So we did, as she stated, we did see a lot of questions surrounding the returning to work and questions about your supervisor maybe not being fully on board with that. And so we just, in that situation, we just encourage you to have conversations with your department leadership, with your supervisors regarding the procedures or the policies for returning to work, what their preferences are, but also making sure you express what your needs are in those conversations and well, but understanding that there has to be a balancing of what the department needs are, what's recognized for your position, and understanding all of that put together goes into the decision on whether there will be certain types of hybrid work schedules looked at. So we do understand that there might be some frustrations that you want a certain thing, but just encourage you to have those conversations. And as was stated in the presentation earlier, just understanding the supervisors are people too, and that they also have their emotional frustrations or feelings about coming back to work. So also approaching them with the compassion and the non-judgment that was spoken about earlier. So just remember that when we are having these conversations.
Thank you, Tanisha. And with
you.
that, I'll hand it off to Brian as our host to go over the rest of the questions in the Q&A.
Thanks, Michelle. Okay, we have a question. Let me see where it went. Okay. I have anxiety about leaving the quiet and focus of my home office, the physical space, which is quiet, focused, and I'm stressing about being back in a louder space, interruptions in my office. Any suggestions to continue the focus I have at home in the work, to continue the focus that I have at home in the workplace? And they mentioned that they do have a door to their office that they can close, but still brings anxiety.
I think that this is a really interesting observation that for some of us, working at home has provided kind of a more ideal way to be productive and to focus. So I think the question I would ask myself in this, since, you know, we're all in one way or another probably going to come back to the on-site environment in one fashion or another, is how can I replicate that a bit? So, I mean, I personally, focus is really important, and that's about mindfulness. The more that you can develop a mindfulness practice, you can actually learn to focus your attention a bit more, even amid more noise and stimulus from the outside. So, you know, by beginning to just do short practices where you're focusing on your breath, then you can then in the workplace, when you even are having distractions in the environment, again, focus on the breath or focus even on the noise in the room, but through continued effort toward learning how to focus your attention over time, you can develop the neural pathways that will make it easier to focus even when it's a little less than ideal. So, and then I think honestly, you should think about some adaptations that you can do. So if it's appropriate and it works for you to keep your door just open, you know I don't ever shut my door because I don't want it to be, like unwelcoming, so, but to keep it kind of 4 inches or 6 inches, or to put noise reducing headphones on. I think adaptations like that can be helpful, and we need to be realistic and honest with ourselves about what is optimal for our own work environment. So coming up with a combination of using mindfulness practice as well as small adaptations like that would be what I would recommend. And maybe also taking short breaks and walking outside, focusing your attention again in a quiet environment. UCI has so many beautiful places on campus where you can sit down for a couple of minutes and just do a really short practice, listen to the birds in the environment and the sounds in the natural environment, focus on your breath, and then come back return into the more busy or active environment. So those are my recommendations.
Thank you. Another one, do you have any guidance or suggestions on how to navigate working with colleagues when we have not been working regularly in the office?
So my recommendation for that would be to, when you're moving into an environment where you're going to be interacting with people and you're not as used to that, right, is to do a short grounding practice. So right as you're moving into right before you're moving into the environment. So for example, I am also a teacher. So right before I walk into my classroom, just taking a moment and focusing on the soles of your feet. Ground your body in the environment. Physicians use this practice as well. It was actually designed originally for medical doctors because it was very easy to be distracted as you're working with one client and then you're anticipating the next one. And so this can also be true as you transition from one space into another space, like from, leaving your office into a group meeting. As you sit down in that meeting, do a grounding practice. Grounding practice means it's a typical practice where you ground your physical body in the space. So the one that I recommend is soles of your feet. Very quick practice, taking all of your attention, focusing it on the soles of your feet and how it's meeting the floor. And then do one breath, one inhale and one exhale. And then begin the conversation with the colleagues or bring your full attention into the meeting that you're in, or begin to teach your class, or begin to see your client, or whatever environment that you work within.
Great. One last quick question before we have to run. You discussed anxiety a lot, but what about depression and burnout? Are there any suggestions on how to navigate that in a work culture where obviously, there are high expectations?
Right. So I was just yesterday talking with a group of participants at the UCI Stem Cell Research Center about burnout and caregiving. And so one of the things I would encourage you to do is to bring more compassion into the environment. When we start to feel burnt out and exhausted by the work demands and high expectations, oftentimes that inner critic comes in pretty strong. And instead to notice what your inner dialogue is and to see if you can shift to a more compassionate voice, using some of the self-compassion phrases that I mentioned in the presentation, and developing that inner dialogue where you can help yourself to be a bit more supportive in those situations, because they are tough, they are hard, and that is a struggle.
Great. Thank you, Deidre, so much. This was a really wonderful webinar. Thank you so much for your time.
Of course, it was a pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you all for attending. Thank you to Deidre, Dr. Janab, to Brian for hosting, and also to our special guest, Tanisha, for answering some HR questions. Again, this has been a very popular webinar series. You'll see on your screen now our upcoming webinars. We encourage you to join to all the topics that interest you. We're so happy to put them on. But thank you all for attending this webinar, and we will see you soon. Bye-bye.